On this page of our notes, we're going to talk about the third type of carbohydrate that we haven't discussed yet. Remember that carbohydrates can be arranged into three groups. We have monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. And so we have talked about monosaccharides. They're the simple molecules that we can use to build these bigger molecules. To make a disaccharide, we're going to need two of the monosaccharides. And now moving on to our polysaccharides. The prefix poly means many. So to build a polysaccharide, you're going to need three or more monosaccharides put together. Now, there are four examples of polysaccharides. I would expect you to remember the first three that we're going to talk about here. Let's go ahead and divide them into kind of two categories here. So two of our polysaccharides have to do with plants. So let's indicate plant cells are going to utilize starch, and plant cells also can make and utilize cellulose. All right, so to talk about those, remember that plants are doing photosynthesis and that makes glucose. So they have a lot of this monosaccharide. And they can then use that glucose in different ways. Now, glucose is energy. Remember that plants and animals must take glucose and turn it into ATP. That's the energy that cells can use. So when they're making glucose all day long, they might not need it right then and there for energy. So they make an excess and they need to store it. And they store it by linking it together. So when you take a look at this starch molecule, if you would just analyze that one little first circle that you see there, that would be glucose. So plants are making that glucose all day long, and then they just string all those glucose molecules together. And we can't call it glucose anymore. It is a polysaccharide, which is called starch. So starch is just made of glucose molecules. Now, plants can make so much glucose that they can store it. So at nighttime, they'll have plenty of glucose stored up there as starch molecules, but they can also take glucose and arrange it a different way, and they can build cell structures with it. And that is what's happening here in this diagram down here. So you probably have labeled before the cell wall in a plant. That cell wall is made of a polysaccharide. It's made of a sugar. And like I mentioned, to make this polysaccharide, we're going to take some extra glucose molecules. We're going to link them together, and that forms this polysaccharide called cellulose. So cellulose builds cell walls. And what I mean by that is that's what the cell walls are built out of. Just like a wall is built of bricks, cellulose is built out of glucose molecules. So it would look very, very similar to what you see up there with starch, just arranged in a different way. All right, now let's switch gears and let's talk about animals. Now, when we eat glucose, we need it for energy. But usually when we eat, we take in more glucose than what we need right at that time. So we need to have a way to save it. So plants store their glucose as starch, but animals link together their glucose a different way. So as you can see here, it looks slightly different. There's more of a branching pattern. So that first little molecule and all the rest that would follow would be glucose molecules. But since they're linked together in a different way, we have a different molecule. It's called glycogen. Oops, and I'm sorry. I don't want to write glycogen there. Let me go back and erase that. We're going to put animal cells. So animal cells or animals, they take their extra glucose, they string it together, and that would be glycogen. And they store it in muscles and in liver cells for whenever later on, after you haven't eaten for a while, then you've got a supply of glucose there. So we'll break up the glycogen and release the glucose for your cells to use. And then the last one, which I'm not going to ask you anything about this one. This is just kind of a fourth molecule here. But we know that whenever we step on bugs, they have this hard outer skeleton. It's called an exoskeleton. And when we hear that crunch, we're breaking that exoskeleton. It's kind of maybe odd to think, but that exoskeleton is a carbohydrate. It is called chitin. And once again, it is made by several glucose molecules linked together to form a bigger molecule, which we would call chitin. So animals like your insects, but also like crabs and lobsters, those crustaceans, that shell is actually a shell of sugar. It's just of a polysaccharide that is called chitin. Now, obviously, if you eat that shell, if you ever had like crab legs or anything like that, and you get a little piece of this shell, you're going to notice that it doesn't taste sweet, even though that you're eating a carbohydrate, a sugar. So one thing I want to point out is starch, glycogen, cellulose, chitin. If you taste them, they will not taste sweet because those are complex sugars. Even though they're all made of glucose, when you string the glucose together into a big molecule, it will not taste sweet. So we call those sugars or complex carbs. And speaking of here, and you have to ignore my spacing, your sheet won't look like this, but the spacing is a little off since I'm looking at a preview there. So just ignore that part down there. Let's talk about the carbs in food. So if you're eating food and it tastes sweet, that means that you're eating disaccharides. So let's indicate you're going to be eating some disaccharides and some monosaccharides. Those are simple sugars and they're going to taste sweet. So when you eat fruits, remember milk is a little bit sweet because it's got lactose in it. So we would have some sugar in milk. Talk about lactose. Any of our sweets in general. So think of our baked goods, cakes, brownies, cookies. All those things are going to be considered sweets. Cereal, because it's sweetened with those simple sugars. When you are eating complex carbs, you're eating sugars, but you won't taste them as sweet. So we are going to use pastas to load up on our carbs, and pastas don't taste sweet. Rice would be all carbs. Anything that is made with flour, like breads, like wheat bread, that's all carb. That's not going to taste sweet. And anything that's made from potatoes, again, isn't going to taste sweet. And that should finish up our notes here on carbohydrates.